Hey everybody, welcome to another study in the Gospel of Mark. Today, we're going to look at chapter 15 and end the study of chapter 15. And we'll begin at verse 42. I just want to remind you that Jesus has been crucified and he's died on the cross. And so it says at verse 42, it was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Mark talks about preparation day, which was the name given to the day before a festival or a Sabbath. And I think the reason Mark includes this in his gospel is for the benefit of his Gentile audience. They wouldn't understand a lot of these Jewish days, so he includes that information. Now, if you remember the timing, since the Jewish Sabbath began at sundown, it's now late in the afternoon. It's probably around 4 p.m. Jesus' body still hangs on the cross, and there's not much time left to take the body of Jesus down before the Sabbath begins. And this is probably what spurred Joseph of Arimathea into action. So Mark says that Joseph's request for the body of Jesus was a bold act. And indeed it was, because it would inevitably identify him with Jesus and with his disciples. And remember, Mark tells us that Joseph is a prominent member of the council, that is, the Sanhedrin. And this is the group that had been instrumental in convicting Jesus of a trumped-up crime and ultimately crucifying him. So his action of asking for the body of Jesus would have some pretty severe consequences for his brethren in the Sanhedrin as they viewed him and what he did. According to Luke chapter 23 and verse 51, Joseph had not consented with his brethren about the decision to crucify Jesus. And Mark adds that he was a man who was waiting for the kingdom of God, which tells you something about him. Now, ordinarily, a relative or a very close friend would ask for the body of a man who had been crucified. But apparently, Jesus' mother was so distraught that she was essentially incapacitated. And we can understand that, given the circumstances. And all of the disciples, except John, had fled. We're told that John was with Jesus' mother by the cross, but John was not going to go ask for the body. None of the disciples were going to do that. Let's look at verses 44 and 45. It says, Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead, talking about Jesus. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he had learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Mark says Pilate is surprised, and the reason he is surprised that Jesus has died is because crucifixion, that gruesome form of punishment that led to death, designed by the Romans, was in part meant to be elongated, to prolong the process of actually killing somebody. That was part of the horror of it all. And so Jesus died relatively quickly by crucifixion, enough to where Pilate was surprised, and he wanted confirmation, in fact, that Jesus had died. You know, if it had not been for the loving act of Joseph of Arimathea, Jesus probably would have been buried in a common criminal's grave. And if you think about it, for Pilate to release the body of a condemned criminal, especially one who had been condemned of high treason, to give that body to someone other than a relative was highly unusual. And it could be that Pilate didn't take seriously the charges against Jesus of high treason. As a matter of fact, when you read, as we have studied earlier, about the trial, you get that distinct impression that Pilate didn't take it seriously. He really didn't believe Jesus had done anything even approximating high treason that deserved death. And so It's unusual, but he did give the body to Joseph of Arimathea. Look at verse 46. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mark does not mention anyone assisting Joseph in taking down the body of Jesus, preparing that body for burial, and then, in fact, burying the body. But Joseph had to have some help. Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 57 that Joseph was a wealthy man, which meant more than likely he had servants. And so it's not a stretch to think that Joseph brought with him at least some of his servants to help him take the body down, prepare the body, put it in the tomb, and roll the stone. We're also told by John in his gospel in chapter 19 that Nicodemus, who had previously come to Jesus by night, in John chapter 3, we read that story, that Nicodemus showed up and he had bought and brought some spices to help prepare the body for burial. So Joseph did not act alone. He had help in removing the body from the cross, preparing it for burial, placing it in the tomb, and rolling the stone in front of the entrance of the tomb. And so now let's read verse 47. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he laid. And that ends chapter 15. There are two Marys mentioned here. And these two Marys are also mentioned, along with Salome, in chapter 15 and verse 40 as being witnesses of the crucifixion. The two Marys then are mentioned by Mark as being present at the burial of Jesus. The reason I think this is significant is because Mark wants us to know that they are aware of where the body of Jesus was buried, where they laid him, so that on Sunday morning, when they go to the tomb, they in fact know where they are going because they had been there for the burial. We'll stop there now. We'll pick it up at our next study in chapter 16 and continue to move toward the resurrection of Jesus.